They say the galaxy is infinite, but it felt small the moment I learned my daughter was missing. I hadn't seen her in years. My missions kept me too far from Earth, and the chasm between us had grown wider than the distance between stars. But when I received the message, all the excuses I'd told myself fell away. She'd been taken. Her name is Sophia, 17 years old, with more fight in her than I ever had at her age. The transmission came from a shadowy syndicate I thought I'd left behind years ago, the Red Talon, a group of mercenaries and slavers operating on the fringe of civilized space. They didn't say much, just coordinates for a dead world called Tyrannies 4 and a warning. Come alone, or she dies. They didn't know me very well. The message came through in the dead of night, the kind of hour where bad news doesn't feel like a possibility. It feels like a certainty. The crackling transmission filled the quiet of the nebula's Grace 2, and as soon as I heard the voice, I knew something was wrong. This is Sophia Rogers. Dad, I need help. They've taken me. Static cut her off, but the terror in her voice was enough to make my blood run cold. Replay that, I barked at the ship's AI. The transmission replayed, just as garbled and incomplete as the first time. Who's they? I muttered under my breath, pacing the bridge. My heart pounded in my chest, and memories of Sophia as a little girl flashed through my mind. Her fearless eyes, her stubborn grin. She was too much like me for her own good. A second message followed. This one wasn't from her. This is Commander Valak of the Red Talon. We have your daughter. If you want her back, come to Tyrannies 4. Alone. No tricks, no backup, or she dies. The Red Talon. I hadn't heard that name in years, but I knew what they were capable of. Slavers, bounty hunters, killers. They were the scum of the galaxy, and they didn't make empty threats. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. You made a mistake taking her. I growled before I could leave. I needed information. Tyrannies 4 wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly. The planet had been abandoned for decades after a mining catastrophe made its atmosphere toxic. Storms raged across its surface, and anyone unlucky enough to get stranded there was as good as dead. Darnell, my comms officer and closest ally, joined me on the bridge as I pulled up a holographic map of the planet. Tyrannies 4, he said, raising an eyebrow. You're seriously going there? They have Sophia, I replied, my tone leaving no room for argument. Darnell sighed, leaning over the console. The Red Talon's been using abandoned planets like this for years. It's the perfect place to stash prisoners and avoid attention. But you know this is a trap, right? Of course it's a trap, I said, pulling up the schematics for the nebula's Grace 2. But they're expecting a desperate father. Let's give them a little more than they bargained for. I spent the next few hours outfitting the ship for the mission. Extra shielding for the storms, upgraded sensors to navigate the debris fields, and enough firepower to take down a small fleet. My personal arsenal was next. Plasma rifles, thermal charges, a compact pulse pistol, and my trusty combat knife. I wasn't going in unarmed. Darnell watched me silently as I packed. Finally, he spoke. You sure about this, Captain? We could call in reinforcements. They said no backup, I interrupted. If they even suspect I didn't come alone, they'll kill her. He nodded reluctantly. Then at least let me stay on the ship and monitor the situation. You might need someone to cover your escape. I hesitated, but I knew he was right. Fine, but you stay in orbit. No heroics. Darnell grinned wryly. Heroics are your department. Tyrannies 4 came into view hours later, a swirling mass of storms and shadows. The planet looked like it had been carved out of chaos itself, its surface jagged and barren beneath the relentless fury of its atmosphere. Scanning for a landing zone, Darnell said as he worked the controls. The ship's sensors struggled against the interference from the storms, but eventually, a faint signal broke through. There's a refinery near the coordinates they gave you, Darnell said, highlighting it on the map. It's ancient, but it looks like it's still operational. That's probably their base. I nodded, studying the layout. The refinery was massive, with multiple levels and enough blind spots to hide an army. Looks like they've fortified it, Darnell continued. You'll have patrols, automated defenses, maybe even drones. Good, I said, strapping on my gear. Let them try to stop me. The descent was rough. The storms buffeted the nebula's Grace 2, the turbulence shaking the ship as I navigated through the dense clouds of ash and lightning. Hold steady, I muttered, gripping the controls tightly. The ship groaned in protest, but it held together, cutting through the chaos like a blade. The surface of Tyrannis 4 came into view, a wasteland of jagged rocks and shattered structures. The refinery loomed in the distance, its massive smokestacks reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Captain, you've got company, Darnell said. Scanners are picking up multiple heat signatures near the landing zone. I brought the ship down in a shallow canyon, using the terrain as cover. As the engines powered down, I grabbed my rifle and checked my comms. I'm going dark, I said. No transmissions unless I call for extraction. Understood, Darnell replied. Be careful down there. Stepping onto the surface of Tyrannis 4 was like stepping into a nightmare. The air was thick with ash, and the sky churned with dark clouds that crackled with occasional bursts of lightning. My suit's filters worked overtime, the rebreather hissing softly with each breath. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, a mix of cracked stone and twisted metal. It felt like the planet itself was a graveyard, its once thriving mining operations reduced to rust and ruin. The refinery loomed ahead, its structure partially obscured by the swirling storm. As I moved closer, I could see the flicker of lights and the silhouettes of guards patrolling the perimeter. They were well-armed and organized, their movements precise. These weren't just mercenaries. They were trained soldiers. Red Talon, I muttered to myself, always overcompensating. Getting past the first line of defenses required patience. The storm provided some cover, but the guards were equipped with thermal sensors, their visors glowing faintly in the darkness. I waited until one of the patrols passed, then moved quickly, keeping low to the ground. My visor highlighted a blind spot in their coverage, a gap in the fence near a rusted maintenance hatch. Slipping through the gap, I found myself in the refinery's lower levels. The air was heavier here, filled with the acrid stench of oil and decay. Pipes lined the walls, their surfaces corroded and leaking a viscous, black fluid. I activated the thermal mode on my visor, scanning for movement. The guards were spread out, their patrols focused on the main corridors. Too easy, I muttered, planning a remote charge on one of the support beams. I moved deeper into the facility, marking key points for sabotage as I went. The deeper I went, the more signs I saw of the Red Talon's operations. Crates of weapons and supplies were stacked in every corner, and the walls were adorned with their insignia, a crimson claw, painted with precision. They weren't just using this place as a hideout. They were planning something bigger. In one of the storage rooms, I found a map of nearby star systems. Several were marked with Red Talon emblems, their locations strategically placed near major trade routes. They're expanding, I thought grimly. Sophia's not the only one they've taken. The thought fueled my anger, and I moved with renewed purpose. The sound of footsteps brought me to a halt. A pair of guards rounded the corner, their rifles at the ready. I ducked into a nearby alcove, waiting for them to pass. The boss says we move out in 2 days, one of them said. Got a buyer lined up for the girl. Some corporate bigwig looking for leverage. My blood ran cold. What about her old man? The other guard asked. Think he'll show? Doesn't matter, the first guard replied. If he does, we kill him. Simple as that. As they moved on, I slipped out of the shadows, my grip tightening on my rifle. You won't get the chance, I muttered, heading toward the cell block. The cell block was heavily guarded, its entrance secured by a reinforced door and 2 sentries. I couldn't risk an alarm, so I took them out quietly, one with a knife to the throat, the other with a silenced plasma shot to the head. The door required a key card. The reinforced door to the cell block was a fortress in itself, but it was no match for desperation and planning. The key card I'd taken from one of the guards was enough to bypass the first layer of security, but the biometric scanner required a more direct approach. I knelt beside the second guard, prying off his glove and pressing his hand to the scanner. The door unlocked with a hiss, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with cells. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of oil and despair. Faint murmurs came from the cells, voices too weak to form coherent words. Most were empty, their occupants long gone, or worse. "Sophia," I called out, keeping my voice low but firm. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a familiar voice. "Dad?" I moved quickly, my boots echoing softly on the metal floor. She was in the last cell, her face pale and bruised but unmistakably hers. Sophia's dark eyes widened when she saw me. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "Of course I did," I said, kneeling in front of her. "Are you hurt?" "Just a few bruises," she replied, her defiance shining through the fear. "They haven't had much time to do worse." I studied the lock on her cell. It was old but sturdy, its mechanisms too complex for brute force. "Stand back," I said, pulling a thermal charge from my pack. She nodded, stepping away as I attached the charge to the lock. The detonation was controlled but loud enough to echo down the corridor. As the cell door swung open, Sophia threw her arms around me. I held her tightly, my heart pounding with a mix of relief and anger. "We're not safe yet," I said, pulling back. "Stay close to me. We're getting out of here." The explosion had been a beacon, and the red talon wasn't about to let us leave quietly. The corridor filled with the sound of boots and shouted orders. "They're coming," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Good," I replied, raising my rifle. "Let's give them something to remember." The first wave of mercenaries rounded the corner, their weapons blazing. I fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. The confined space worked to my advantage, forcing them into a bottleneck. Sophia stayed behind me, picking up a fallen pistol and covering my flank. "Didn't know you could shoot," I said, ducking behind cover to reload. "You didn't think I'd go through life without learning a few tricks, did you?" she replied, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "That's my girl," I muttered. Stepping back into the fight, the cell block was a kill zone, and every step toward the exit felt like a battle for survival. The Red Talon mercenaries were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. "Darnell," I called over the comms, were pinned down in the lower levels. "How's the extraction looking?" "Not great," he replied. "Storms are picking up, and their anti-air defenses are still online. I can't get close without taking fire. Then take out those defenses," I said, ducking as a plasma bolt scorched the wall beside me. "On it," he replied. "Just hold tight." The fight moved through the corridors, each turn bringing new challenges. Automated turrets activated, their barrels whirring to life as they locked onto us. I destroyed the first with a well-placed shot, but the others forced us into a side passage. "This way," I said, leading Sophia down a maintenance shaft. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice strained from exertion. "Out," I replied. "Just trust me." The maintenance shaft led to the refinery's central hub, a massive chamber filled with machinery and catwalks. The air was thick with heat and the hiss of steam, and the sound of heavy machinery drowned out most other noise. Sophia looked around, her expression skeptical. "Are you sure this is a way out?" "No," I admitted, "but it's better than waiting to get surrounded." As we moved through the chamber, the sound of footsteps echoed above us. I glanced up, spotting a squad of mercenaries on the catwalks, their weapons trained on us. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Sophia forward as plasma bolts rained down. We sprinted through the maze of machinery, using the pipes and metal beams as cover. The heat was suffocating, and every step felt like a gamble. "They're cutting us off," Sophia yelled, pointing to another squad approaching from the far side of the chamber. I cursed under my breath, scanning the area for an escape route. My eyes landed on a massive conveyor belt leading to a chute. "This way," I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward it. The conveyor belt rumbled beneath our feet, its surface slick with oil and debris. The mercenaries fired after us, their shots sparking against the metal. "Down the chute," I shouted, pushing Sophia ahead of me. She hesitated for only a moment before jumping into the narrow tunnel. I followed, the sound of gunfire fading as we slid into darkness. The chute dumped us into a lower chamber, its walls lined with pipes that hissed and groaned. I helped Sophia to her feet, checking her for injuries. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, brushing herself off. "What about you?" "I'll live," I replied, though my muscles ached from the strain of the fight. We didn't get far before the mercenaries found us again. They surrounded us in a storage room, their rifles trained on us. "End of the line, Rogers," one of them sneered, stepping forward. I raised my rifle, but before I could fire, Sophia grabbed my arm. "No," she said, her voice steady. "Let me." She stepped forward, her pistol in hand. The mercenaries hesitated, clearly not expecting her to fight back. In the split second of their confusion, I moved, taking out the closest one with a shot to the chest. The room erupted into chaos, and together, we fought our way out. The refinery's upper levels were a battlefield, the sound of explosions and gunfire echoing through the halls. "Darnell, we're almost at the surface," I said over the comms. "Tell me you've got something for me." "Anti-air defenses are down," he replied. "I'm bringing the ship in now. Get to the extraction point." We raced to the final corridor, the exit just ahead. The storm outside was deafening, the wind howling as lightning lit up the sky. The nebula's Grace 2 hovered just beyond the entrance, its engines roaring. The side hatch opened and Darnell waved us in. "Move it," he shouted. We sprinted toward the ship, plasma bolts whizzing past us. I turned, firing one last burst to cover Sophia before diving into the hatch. "Go!" I yelled, slamming the door shut. The ship lifted off, the storm swallowing the refinery as we ascended into the sky. The nebula's Grace 2 shuddered as it climbed through the dense atmosphere of Tyrannis 4. The storm outside was relentless, lightning cracking like the planet itself was trying to stop us. "We're not out of this yet," Darnell said, his hands flying over the controls. I glanced at the sensors. Multiple blips lit up, closing in fast. "Gunships," I muttered, gripping the back of his chair. "Looks like the Red Talon isn't taking this lightly," he replied. Sophia stood behind me, her face pale but determined. "What do we do now?" "Now," I said, turning to her. "We fight." The gunships swarmed around us like vultures, their weapons lighting up the stormy sky. The nebula's Grace 2 wasn't a warship, but she was fast and built to take a beating. "Divert power to shields," I ordered, sliding into the weapons console. "Already on it," Darnell replied. "But we can't keep this up for long." The first gunship fired a volley of plasma bolts, the shots rattling the hull. I returned fire, the ship's rear cannons tearing through the lead vessel. It exploded in a brilliant flash, the shockwave rocking the others. "That's one down," I said, targeting the next. Sophia watched from the corner, her hands gripping the edge of a console. "Is this what you do all the time?" she asked, her voice tense but steady. "Not every day," I replied, firing another volley. "But it happens more often than I'd like." The second gunship circled around, its cannons charging for another attack. Darnell banked hard to the left, narrowly avoiding the blast. "Captain, we've got a problem," he said, pointing to the sensors. "They've called for reinforcements. 3 more ships inbound." "Damn it," I muttered. Taking out the second gunship with a well-placed shot, the odds were stacking against us. The storm limited their visibility, but it was doing the same to us. The shields were holding for now, but it wouldn't last. "We need to lose them," Darnell said, his voice strained. "We're not equipped for a prolonged fight." I studied the readouts, my mind racing. The refinery's core had been unstable. Its entire structure was one big powdered keg waiting to go off. "Take us low," I said. "What?" Darnell asked, turning to me in disbelief. "You heard me," I said. "Back to the refinery." Sophia's eyes widened. "You're going back?" "Not to stay," I said, gripping the console. "We're gonna light it up." The Nebula's Grace 2 dove through the storm, the gunships hot on our tail. The refinery loomed below, its skeletal structure barely visible through the haze. "Darnell, line us up with the central core," I said, my fingers flying over the weapons console. "You're insane," he muttered, but he complied, bringing the ship into position. "Sophia, get to the cargo hold and strap in," I said. "But now," I barked. She hesitated, then nodded, disappearing down the corridor. The gunships closed in, their cannons lighting up the sky. I fired back, taking out another with a lucky shot, but the others were relentless. "Get us as close as you can," I said, priming the ship's payload of thermal charges. Darnell glanced at me. "You sure about this?" "Just do it," I replied. The Nebula's Grace 2 swooped low, skimming the refinery's outer edge. The gunships followed, their weapons tearing through the structure as they tried to hit us. I targeted the core, releasing the charges in a precise pattern. They attached to the refinery's support beams, their timers ticking down. "Charges are set," I said. "Get us out of here." The ship climbed rapidly, the engines screaming as Darnell pushed them to their limit. The gunship stayed on us, but the countdown on the charges was nearly complete. 3 seconds, I said, my eyes fixed on the timer. The charges detonated in a massive explosion, the shockwave tearing through the refinery. The gunships closest to the blast were obliterated instantly, their wreckage consumed by the fireball. The others broke off, retreating as the storm swallowed the destruction. The Nebula's Grace 2 shuddered but held together, the shields absorbing the brunt of the blast. "Target neutralized," I said. Leaning back in my chair, the ship emerged from the storm into the calm of open space. The sensors showed no sign of pursuit. The Red Talon had been dealt a crippling blow. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of awe and disbelief. "You blew it up," she said. "Damn right I did," I replied. Darnell smirked. "You've got a hell of a dad, kid." Sophia looked at me, her eyes softening. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I guess I do." In the quiet that followed, I sat with Sophia in the ship's galley. She nursed a cup of tea, her hands still trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice softer now. She nodded. "I will be." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," I said finally, "for being gone so long, for not being there when you needed me." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and understanding. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Back in my quarters, I recorded a final entry. "This is Captain John Rogers of the Nebula's Grace 2. Mission to Tyrannies 4. Successful. The Red Talon's base has been destroyed and my daughter is safe. But this wasn't just a rescue. It was a wake-up call. For too long, I've let the stars pull me away from what really matters. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing. I'm not losing her again. Until next time, stay curious. And keep looking up." I set the recorder down, my gaze drifting to the viewport. The galaxy was vast, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel quite so lonely.